私を導く私は影私は刃光を切り裂く強き力
Hello everyone, this is Leon. In this video, we'll be making FeiXiao's Gunblade from Honkai Star Rail. We'll be using mainly EVA foam because it is lightweight and more convention friendly. As usual, I have left the template link down in the description below, so feel free to check it out. After that, print out the template on the papers, cut along the dash line and connect them with tape. Next is my personal preference. I will usually stick it onto a harder cardstock. Right now, I have already attached the template onto a harder cardstock, so it will be much more harder and sturdier than my financial status. Initially, my plan is I'm going to cut along this red line that you can see over here, and that includes the blade. But as soon as I realized this part is actually too big, because my initial plan is I'm going to make this into just one big piece, one whole piece, so I can sand it down and then attach the blade onto it. But I realized sanding this bigger surface is actually much harder than you can imagine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to separate these two parts, and we will do the base first and then attach the blade afterward. So first is to cut out only this part without the blade, then make copies on one 1cm foam and two 5mm foam. The 1cm foam will be used as the middle piece and sandwiched by the 5mm foam. This is because the middle support structure I use is around 1cm. Now use an 1cm aluminum tube and cut it to length. After that, trace it onto the 1cm foam, and then make cuts on the longer side with a sharp razor knife. After that, using contact adhesive to attach the 1cm piece to the 5mm piece. To use a contact adhesive, you will need to apply it onto both sides and wait for it to dry. Please be minded that do not brush onto this middle part, because it only serves as a support piece for now, and it will be removed afterwards. After that, cover one side with some papers and then stick slowly while moving the paper. This will avoid the foam sticking on unwanted place when you're working on the other side. Now remove this middle foam and slot the aluminum tube in, and make sure it fits. After that, use an AB steel epoxy to fix the aluminum tube in place. To use an AB steel epoxy, you will need to mix both chemical parts equally. Apply into the gate, and then place the aluminum tube into it and wait for it to cure. Once the epoxy is cured, sandwich the other side with other 5mm foam. After that, I realized I made a mistake because I totally forgot about this hole. So I quickly made a new one with basically same method, but longer tube, and bend it slightly to avoid the hole. After that, it is basically the same thing over, and pretend nothing ever happens. Now let's move on to the blade. Press the template onto the 70° 4mm foam, and then do slanted cut on both edges. Take note that at the edge that connect to the main sword, will only require slight angle cut, but the edge at the sharp end will need much lower angle. After that, use super glue to attach one part onto the sword first. I recommend using super glue and a dropper because super glue dries fast, and a dropper will make it easier to control. After one side is done, as you can see here, the angle isn't really low enough, so we have to sand it afterwards. By the time I'm at this stage, it was already night, so I proceed to prepare the other parts. That needs to be sanded down, so let's move on to the handle. This will need two copies on 5mm foam, and then attach it on with contact adhesive. After that, move on to the gun barrel. First is cut this part out of the previous template, and then make two copies on 5mm foam and one copy on 1cm foam. After that, stick the foam in a similar order as the blade, which is 5 + 1 + 5. Now print another set of this template and cut out the gun barrel part. Make two copies on 1cm foam and sandwich the previous piece, so the gun barrel parts can be processed separately. So the good thing about doing things like this is because I can just sand off this side and this side without worrying the risk of sanding onto this blade for this part as well as this part, because this holding part, we have to sand down this part from this 5mm layer up to this another 5mm layer, and to maintain this 1cm layer. That means if I attach this part into it, I might oversand to here, which is something that I don't want. After that, mark all the sanding line As for the gun barrel, I roughly mark a line about 1 cm from the edge to use it as the sanding line. After sanding all the necessary parts, it should look like this. Now finish up the blade. It might take a little bit of time, but be patient and it will turn out great. At the same time, also not to forget about this. I made copies on hard 4mm foam and this slanted cut on the part that is attaching to the blade. Just like the blade, if the angle isn't low enough, feel free to sand it. Once the blade is done, let's move on to the details at the handle. I separated this part also because it will be easier for sanding and painting afterwards. Now make 2 copies on this of 5mm foam including the trigger. And then use a wooden skewer to enhance the bottom tip. Trim it to shorter length, mark the space and then make a V-groove cut on both sides. Then fix the skewer in place. And finally sandwich the other side with contact adhesive. Now the tip will be stronger than my will to live. Now mark the details and add the details layer on top of it. For the golden parts we will be using 5mm foam. And then 1 cm foam for this part. I also marked the sanding line, so I will not confuse when sanding it. Just simply mark the edge like this so you will remember which edge to sand. Now use contact adhesive to fix this first because we will be sanding it to the layers below. After sanding, it should look like this. Now attach the remaining details on with contact adhesive. Next, I almost forgot this part, so I quickly make copies on 2mm foam and attach it on with contact adhesive. And make shallow cuts on the detail line. Now remove some of these parts and mark all the details onto the blade. Now proceed to this part and make 1 copy on 5mm foam. Then manually add the sanding line. After that I remove this part, but I regret afterwards, so you can ignore it. And attach this onto the sword with contact adhesive. Now let's move on to the top layer of the blade and make copies on 2mm foam. Then connect both sides first. After that, attach it onto the blade with super glue. Make sure all the edges are sealed nicely with super glue, so it will not open up. Now continue with other details, so let's move on to this part. Make 2 copies on 3mm foam and do slanted cut at the edges. This will give additional details onto this part and make it look nicer. After that, attach it onto the blade. Next, come back to the gun barrel again. This time we'll wrap this with 2mm foam. First cut a bigger piece of 2mm foam that is bigger than the barrel. Then stick it on with contact adhesive. At the same time, also trim off the excess foam with a razor knife. Now use a 5mm half double foam and stick it onto the top part of the gun barrel. After that, cut 2 1cm strap on 2mm foam. This will go on both sides of the edge. After that, just attach it onto the barrel. Trim off the excess foam. Now that the gun barrel base is done, let's add on the details. First mark the position of the parts. Then I make copies on the cardstock and manually extend some parts. It took me a few tries to finally get the perfect one for me, but I will attach this part into the final template. After finally got the perfect one, make 1 copy on a 2mm foam and attach it on with contact adhesive. After that, mark a parallel line here. It is for the red line. And then make a shallow cut with razor knife. Next, proceed to this part of the detail. Mark the position, modify the template, and then make 1 copy on 2mm foam. Also make these details on 2mm foam and layer it on top of that part. And then attach it on with contact adhesive. After that, mark this detail line and then make a shallow cut. And for the remaining parts, we'll also be using the same technique. Modify the template and attach it on with contact adhesive. Now proceed to this part at this end. Place the barrel on the cardstock and make a copy of the shape. Then I manually extend the edge because this part is meant to be slightly bigger than the barrel. After that, make 1 copy on the 3mm foam and attach it onto the barrel. Next will be this side on the barrel. First sandwich 2 pieces of this with 5mm foam and then add on this pointy part with 3mm foam. After that, cut a V groove at the bottom because this will be attaching onto the barrel and the barrel surface is curved. Lastly, we'll be adding this layer with 2mm foam and then make shallow cut with a razor knife. After that, I realized I've made this part a little bit too big, so I have to remove it. But I'll update this in the final template. Now manually measure this line at about 1 cm away from the detail, and then manually draw a straight line to the other end. Take note that this line is not parallel, as the front will be slightly smaller, so take your time to measure it to the best one for you. After that, do a shallow cut. Remember that the line is not going through the top layer, so it is on the bottom layer. Last but not least will be this for the front side. Just make one copy on 5mm foam and attach it onto the barrel will do. After the barrel is done, it is time to add the rest of the details onto the sword. So slowly remove the details part by part, and then trace onto the sword. Most of the details will be doing shallow cuts, except these two golden parts. Just make copies on 2mm foam, and then stick onto the sword. After that, use a razor knife and make shallow cuts on the remaining details. And if you wonder why, that's because this will help with the masking process afterward. Now that most of the details are done, so I put a tiny bit of glue and stick the parts onto the sword, just to see how it looks like. Next, add on this part with 5mm foam. I also did slanted cut on the side just to give it a little bit dimension. After that will be the small pointy part on top. Now continue to add on the details on top of the handle. I used 2mm foam for these golden parts and make shallow cuts on the line. I also did the same thing on the remaining details on the handle. Now it is only few parts left to do. This is the golden thing on the handle. Just make one copy on 1cm foam and it will be sent down afterward. Continue with these following details. Using 5mm foam, make a cut along the longest line, and then make slight V cut around the eye. This will be able to make the eye pop a little. As for the bottom jaw, also use same 5mm foam. Next, we still got few more parts to do, so let's start with this flint hammer. I use 5mm as the base, but I'm separating into two parts so it'll be easier to sand afterwards. I add a 1cm layer at the hammer part, and 2mm on the circle, and 3mm on the screw. Moving to this, we'll be using 5mm for the whole structure. Then cut a V groove on the details, and it should look like this. While for the screw, we'll be using 3mm foam. After sanding all the parts, the triangle part should look like this. After that, just attach it onto the sword with contact adhesive. As for the screws and circle, I only round off the edges, and this is the hammer. After attaching the part, I did a quick test and realized it is quite loose, so I add another small piece of foam at the back on both sides. For this lion head, I cut this part off and stick it and the cut at the eye slightly offset, to give it a little bit more dimension. For the bottom jaw, I cut off this and stick it slightly offset as well. Last but not least, I almost forgot about this. This will be quite straightforward. I use two copies on 1cm foam and sandwich on 3mm foam. After that, attach it onto the sword. Mark the center line, and then sand it down. Now everything is finally done, so the final step before painting will be heating the foam with a heat gun. This step is important because heating the foam will melt and close the tiny pores. This will flatten the surface and make the surface much smoother. But please be minded that heating on the same spot for too long will burn the foam. After that will be another important step, which is priming. I use water-based paint to prime, but it will require a compressor and a spray gun. If you don't have access to it, you can use a PVA glue or white glue, or even plastic dip will do. Priming will create a layer for actual paint to sit on, so it is also a pretty important step before the actual painting. After priming, I first paint a few black parts, and then mask it with masking tape. After that, I paint a layer of silver base first, then paint the white part, and again cover the white parts with masking tape. After that, basically repeat the same few steps until all the colors are done. Now it may seem done, but it is not quite yet. I use acrylic paint to paint the lion eye manually. After that, using black acrylic paint to add some shade. It is basically just dry brushing to the corner. This will give more contrast to the color and make everything pop. After the paint job is done, the final step will be attaching the remaining parts. This is pretty straightforward, but we'll need to scrape off the paint first, so the part will stick directly onto the foam, not the paint. After that, it is finally done.
的要一